Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome you all for the pre-conference webinar series organized as part of the International Conference on Environmental Monitoring and Management, known as EMM2020. This is organized by the Center for Environmental Studies and the International Relations Office of the University of Peradeniya. This is the third of this series, the pre-conference webinar series that we have, and we are going to discuss in this webinar on environmental impact assessment. And I will be the moderator, and I am Dr. Nalani Hennayake from the Department of Geography at the University of Peradeniya. Just to start off, as you know, environmental impact assessment is extremely important for environmental management and monitoring process. I would even start by saying that it is almost the backbone of environmental management and monitoring process. And EIA has been in practice as well as in discussion in Sri Lanka since the early 1990s. And as you all know, now it's a mandatory requirement for all prescribed projects as it is enacted in the National Environmental Act of 1988. And this webinar, we have two experts on the subject to enlighten us on this very important topic. And each of our experts will be given 20 minutes, and they will make a presentation. And then, of course, after that, we would have another 20 minutes for the panel discussion. As you can see on the screen, this is our program for the webinar. And we will start off with Mrs. Kanthi De Silva, and then followed up with Professor Wickramagamage, and then we would come to a 20 minutes panel discussion with your questions and queries. And before I start the session, I would like to remind the participants, actually to request the participants to follow the instructions given. As you can see on the screen, please be kind enough to mute your microphones and turn off video, because I am told that a very large number of participants have registered and they are logging in. And in order to make this webinar a very smooth, webinar, we need your support. So please follow the instructions. Instructions are also given as to how you will forward your questions and queries in the chat section, and send either to all panelists or all panelists and attendees as you wish. And we would screen those comments and questions and then come back to you during the panel discussion. Now I would go on to introduce our first speaker, who is joining with us from Colombo, from the Central Environmental Authority. She is Mrs. Kanthi De Silva, Deputy Director General of the Central Environmental Authority of Sri Lanka. And she has been there since almost 1993 in executive positions, and especially in relation to policy and decision-making process of the environmental impact procedure. And I think the best way to introduce Mrs. Kanthi De Silva for you, the participants, would be to say that she is a person who would have read the most number of environmental impact assessment reports submitted to Sri Lanka. I think as a result, she brings us an enormous amount of experience to share with us at the policy and decision-making level relating to environmental impact assessment. With that little note, I hand over to Mrs. Kanthi De Silva, who is joining with us from Colombo. Over to you, Mrs. De Silva.
Thank you. Okay. Can you see my slide presentation? Okay, I'll start my presentation. So today we are talking about the environmental impact assessment process in Sri Lanka. Since I'm the first speaker, I will start with the definition of the environmental impact assessment. EIA is a simple and straightforward process of first predicting the potential environmental impacts of development activities on the natural and social environment, and then suggesting measures to prevent or minimize negative impacts. So in an EIA, we consider two aspects. One is identification of environmental impacts of a development project, and then if the impacts are significant, suggesting mitigation measures to reduce or prevent the environmental impacts. That is the simplest definition of the environmental impact assessment. In fact, actually, environmental impact assessment, if carried out properly, benefits first and foremost the developer. It helps the government agencies in taking informed decisions also. So basically, environmental impact assessment is the best tool for sustainable development. Right? So, in fact, actually, now I have been working at the Central Environmental Authority since 1993, that is since introduction of the environmental impact assessment process in Sri Lanka. So basically with my experience, I can tell you this. Now in Sri Lanka, EIA was first introduced by the Coast Conservation Act of 1981. So the Coast Conservation Act is applicable to the coastal zone of Sri Lanka. So we all know what the coastal zone is. The coastal zone is defined as 300 meters landward from the mean high water line and 2 kilometers seaward from the mean low water line. So that the entire belt is considered as the coastal zone. So the Coast Conservation Act is applicable for the coastal zone. So initially in 1981, the EIA was first introduced in the Coast Conservation Act. But in 1988, in the National Environmental Act, this EIA was introduced, and accordingly, the EIA was mandatory for the entire country since 1988. But basically, the regulations were published in 1993. So in practice, the EIA is being adopted in Sri Lanka since 1993. So EIA procedure has been evolved since its inception in late 1980s or in early 1990s, because the regulations were gazetted in 1993, and it's been implemented satisfactorily with the state agencies taking the lead role. So we know that somebody might say that EIA is less than satisfactory in Sri Lanka, but I have to say this: EIA process has been recognized by the society as a sustainable development tool. That is why everybody talks about the EIA process, right? So we are proud of that. EIA process has provided the mechanism for integration of environmental and social aspects in development initiatives. Because we know that at least there is a mechanism now to integrate this environmental and social aspects in the development process. Without that, nobody knows how the development projects are being approved. So EIA process has given communities and citizens an opportunity to voice their concerns in decision making of development initiatives. So basically we know that the EIA process is the only process wherein the general public can get involved in none of the other processes in practiced by government agencies. there is no opportunity for general public to get involved in. Right? So this is the, I think, main process. There are some processes, but this is the main process for the general public to voice their concerns. Right? So then we will move to the legal framework governing EIA. So in national level, the EIA has been introduced in 3 different acts. So main act is the National Environmental Act. So EIA has been included in the National Environmental Act since 1988. So area of application is, of course, actually, I will first talk about the 2 and 3. So except 2 and 3, the rest of the area, the National Environmental Act is applicable. So I'll start from the second one, the Coast Conservation Act. So initially the EIA was first introduced in the Coast Conservation Act. The area of application is the coastal zone. So the implementing agency is the Coast Conservation Department. So now the name has now been changed as Coast Conservation and Coastal Resources Management Department, but for the convenience, I will speak as the Coast Conservation Department, right? So the implementing agency is the Coast Conservation Department. So in their act also, EIA has been included. And then EIA has been included in the Fauna and Flora Protection Act also. So area of application is the national reserves and 1 mile buffer zone of the national reserves. So what are national reserves? So national reserves are, actually there are 3 different kinds of national reserves in Sri Lanka: strict nature reserves, and national parks. So all are gazetted under the Fauna and Flora Protection Act. And in addition to the reserves, 1 mile buffer zone from the boundary of a reserve has also been gazetted under the Fauna and Flora Protection Act. So the developments falling within this area are subjected to EIA procedure under the Fauna and Flora Protection Act. So the implementing agency is the Department of Wildlife Conservation, right? So now excluding the coast conservation area and this gazetted area under the Fauna and Flora Protection Act, the rest of the area is governed under the National Environmental Act. So just keep in mind, so EIA is basically included in 3 different acts, but the main act is the National Environmental Act because the area of application is large compared to other 2. Basically, there are very small changes. I will explain you the changes. The process is same in all 3 acts. However, there is a provincial level environmental statute established by the Northwestern Provincial Authority. We call it as Northwestern Provincial Environmental Statute. The area of application is the Northwestern Province. So under this act, they have enacted separate environmental impact assessment regulations. So, but this is applicable only for the Northwestern Province. That is the provincial, that is of course actually provincial level acts, not at national level. Okay. So these are the main legal framework governing EIA in Sri Lanka. We will move to the major provisions given under the Act. So basically you just have to keep in mind these main provisions. So EIA is required only for prescribed development projects. What are prescribed development projects, right? We identify prescribed development projects as major development projects which have some kind of significant environmental impacts. But in the under the National Environmental Act, we have published the list of prescribed projects which require environmental impact assessment to be carried out. This list has been published in the Gazette number 772/22 of 24th June 1993. So EIA is required only for those projects which are included in the prescribed list under the National Environmental Act. But there is a difference. I will tell you the difference later. So these are the prescribed projects. So if you go through the Gazette, you can very clearly identify that there are 2 categories of prescribed projects. One is under the first category, we have identified different types of projects with magnitudes. I have given certain examples here. Hotels over 99 rooms, highways over 10 kilometers, filling of wetlands over 4 hectares. So likewise, various types of projects have been identified with magnitudes. So if the magnitude exceeds this level only, the project requires to undergo the environmental impact assessment procedure. In addition, the second category is depending on the location. So if any of the projects identified in category 1 is located in an environmental sensitive area, irrespective of the magnitude, the project requires to undergo the environmental impact assessment process. So in this, under this category, we have identified what the environmental sensitive areas are. So I have given certain examples here. So if the project is falling within any of these environmental sensitive areas, so irrespective of the magnitude, the project requires to undergo the environmental impact assessment process. So that is how the list has been prepared. Now, I want to tell you that under the Coast Conservation Act, there is no such prescribed list given. So the Director General Coast Conservation Department has been given authority to determine whether an EIA is required for a project, and he takes that decision, right? So there is no such prescribed list given. So under the Fauna and Flora Protection Act, the difference is this: there is no such prescribed list, and the DG has not been given any discretionary powers also. Almost all development activities falling within the buffer zones of national reserves require to undergo the environmental impact assessment process. There are no exceptions. All, even very small scale project requires to undergo the EIA process if it is falling within the buffer zone of a national reserve. So we are not talking about the national reserves, within national reserves, because developments are not allowed within national reserves. So only the buffer zone is allowed for development activities, but after a proper EIA under the Fauna and Flora Protection Act, and the approving authority is the Department of Wildlife Conservation. Okay. Second main important aspect is the EIA process for any prescribed project is administered by a project approving agency, right? So basically you may have heard that, you may be knowing that the Central Environmental Authority is the approving authority for EIA projects. But in the Act, we have been given authority to delegate our powers to certain identified government agencies. We call these agencies as approving agencies. So, project approving agencies are government agencies that are responsible for administrating EIAs for projects. The Central Environmental Authority is the lead project approving agency. The several state agencies have been recognized in the Gazette, identified in the Gazette, for which the CEA authority can be delegated. So basically, based on the location of the project and the relevancy to the project approving agency, the Central Environmental Authority at the very beginning determines who the appropriate project approving agency for that specific project. Accordingly, CEA designate that project approving agency for administering the EIA process. Usually, a large majority of EIA applications pass through the CEA, leaving only very small percentage in the hands of other PAs. So usually what you can just keep in mind is Central Environmental Authority is the lead project approving agency, but there are provisions for us to delegate our authority to certain identified government agencies. Okay. There are two levels of EIA. One is initial environmental examination and the second is environmental impact assessment. So criteria for selecting is the significance of impacts. The project approving agency has the authority to determine at the beginning of the process whether what is required is an initial environmental examination or environmental impact assessment based on the impacts of the, based on the significance of impacts of the project. Whether what is an EIA for a project at the beginning of the process. Either an EIA report, either an IE report or EIA report is required to be submitted in respect of any prescribed project. Either an IE or EIA, right? Only one. the project may either require an IE report or EIA report in case of a complicated environmental, complicated project. Okay, so that will be determined by the project approving agency at the very beginning. So what is the difference between an IE and EIA? An IEE is a relatively short and simple study, while an EIA is a more detailed and comprehensive study of environmental impacts. So because of that, usually projects having complicated environmental impacts are referred for EIA, or otherwise, if the project may not have such complicated environmental impacts, we may refer the project to undergo the IEE procedure. But there is another provision in the Act. At any stage, if the project approving agency determines that the IE would not be adequate, the CEA or the project approving agency has the authority to upgrade the process to the EIA level. Okay. Next provision is EIA report is required to be open for public review and comment for a mandatory 30 days. So in fact, actually, this is mandatory, but this provision is applicable only for the EIA process. Public review is not mandatory for IE reports. So that is the main difference between the EIA and IE. Okay. Next provision is the project approving agency shall follow the procedure published in the Gazette number 772/22 of 24th June 1993 in granting EIA or IE approval. So a procedure has been very clearly laid down in the Gazette. So now we will move to the process. Summary of steps in the EIA or IE approval process. According to the Gazette of the Gazette published under the National Environmental Act. This process is being very much actually similar in all three acts. Usually Coast Conservation Department also follows the same procedure, and the Department of Wildlife Conservation also follows the same procedure. Okay. So the first step is the submission of preliminary information. Preliminary information includes the project concept. So once the project concept is developed by the project proponent, he or she should submit the proposal to the Central Environmental Authority, right? So the project proponent is responsible for developing the project concept. So the CEA or the project approving agency is not responsible for developing the project concept. So the developer has to submit his project concept to the Central Environmental Authority in order to initiate the EIA or IEE process, right? If the project is located within the coastal zone, the project proponent can directly submit his application to the Coast Conservation Department. There is no requirement to submit the application to the CEA. He or she can directly submit his application to the Coast Conservation Department. If the project is located within the 1 mile buffer zone of a national reserve, the project proponent should directly submit this application to the Department of Wildlife Conservation. Okay, right? Is the screening. Screening. The meaning of screening is determining whether an EIA or IE is required for a project. So screening is done by reference to the Gazette number 772/22. So in this Gazette, I have already mentioned that in this Gazette, we have published the list of prescribed projects requiring EIA. So if the application is submitted to CEA, what we do is we will refer to the prescribed list and check whether the project is falling within that list. If it is not within that list, there's no requirement to undergo the EIA or IE process. But if the project is falling within that list, EIA or IE is a mandatory requirement under the National Environmental Act. We have not been given authority to take subjective decision. So our screening is very clear, right? But if the project is located within the Coast Conservation Department zone, coastal zone, as I told you, there is no such prescribed list. The DG Coast Conservation determines whether the project requires to undergo the EIA or IE procedure, right? But similarly, if the project is falling within the 1 mile buffer zone of a national park, national reserve, every application for development activities should follow the EIA/IE procedure under the 49 Flora Protection Act. So that is the difference about screening. Scoping, the meaning of scoping is the identifying issues and impacts to be addressed in the EIA/IE report. So PA undertakes, the project PA means the project approving agency. The project approving agency undertakes the formal scoping process with all stakeholder agencies to determine the terms of reference for the IEO/EIA study. Right? So based on the findings of the scoping process, the terms of reference will be drafted by the project approving agency. So the preparation of the terms of reference is with the project approving agency. So what is terms of reference? The terms of reference is a guideline document defining the aspects to be studied in the EIA/IE study. So, but what you have to keep in mind is terms of reference is not a rigid document. It is a kind of a flexible document. It can be changed at any stage if the project approving agency or the consulting teams identifies more issues which needs to be addressed in the EIA study. So those things can be included in the terms of reference, right? It's a kind of a flexible document. You have to consider the terms of reference only as a guideline document defining the scope of the study, right? The responsibility of preparing the terms of reference is with the project approving agency. The fourth step is the EIA study. So this is the most important step in the EIA process, right? So EIA, once the TOR is issued by the project approving agency, it's up to the project proponent to prepare, to carry out the EIA study. So EIA studies are usually undertaken by a team of experts hired by the project proponent. Usually project proponent is not competent enough to carry out the EIA study by himself. So he usually hire a team of consultants to carry out the EIA study. But the EIA study should be within the terms of reference, not strictly, but basically it should be within the EIA terms of reference issued by the authority. So in the EIA study, we usually expect following aspects, answers to the following questions. What will happen as a result of the project? That means impact identification. Impact identification has to be done by the EIA consultants. Identification is not that difficult. It's easy, but identification is not adequate. The second question is, what will be the extent of changes? So you need to carry out, once the impacts are identified, then it has to be quantified also to the extent possible. So you may not be able to, consultants may not be able to quantify all the impacts, but at least to the extent they have to quantify the impacts. Without that, you can't determine whether the impact is significant or not. And then the third question is, are the impacts significant? Once the impacts are quantified, then the consultant has to determine whether the impact is significant. And then if the impacts are significant, the fourth question is, what can be done about them? Then if the impacts are significant, then you need to propose mitigation measures to reduce or prevent the significant impacts. So those four questions should be answered in the EIA report, basically. So there are techniques to carry out, to quantify the impacts. First to identify the impacts, then to quantify the impacts, and then to determine whether the impacts are significant. And then there are techniques available for the mitigation of environmental impacts. So you need to suggest all these things, and then all this, once the study is completed, all the findings should be documented, and this document is called as the Environmental Impact Assessment Report or Initial Environmental Examination Report. This report should be prepared based on the findings of the study. This report is very, very important because the authority will take the decision whether to grant approval for a project based on this report. Okay. So once the report is prepared, it has to be submitted to the project approving authority by the project proponent. Then, so by the project approving agency, it has to be reviewed to check whether the report is adequate and whether the information given is accurate. So the report will be reviewed by the, as I told you at the very beginning, will be reviewed by general public as well as a technical evaluation committee appointed by the project approving authority. This review by the general public is not applicable in case of initial environmental examination process, but this is applicable only for the EIA process. So first general public review will be carried out first, and then subsequent to the public review, technical review will be done by the project approving authority. For this purpose, the project approving authority will appoint a technical evaluation committee. This committee may be represented by stakeholder agencies as well as some experts to evaluate this report. The report is prepared. So during the technical evaluation procedure, the technical evaluation committee will consider the EIA report as well as the public comments received during the public review period, right? So the public comments will also be given due respect during the review procedure. So once the review process is completed, the technical evaluation committee will submit their recommendations to the project approving authority. So the project approving authority will take the decision whether to grant approval for the project based on the recommendations of the technical evaluation committee. So if the technical evaluation committee recommends granting approval for the project, project approving authority issues the environmental approval letter subject to conditions. These conditions usually includes all mitigation measures which needs to be implemented by the project proponent during implementation of the project. So during the implementation of the project, it has to be monitored by the project approving authority to check whether the compliance are met and to check whether there are any additional impacts which have not been anticipated during the environmental impact assessment process. Okay, but self-monitoring is also must by the project proponent, and he has to submit his self-monitoring reports to the project approving authority periodically. So this is the actual stepwise process of the EIA. Preliminary information, determining whether an EIA is necessary, we call it as screening, and then deciding on the coverage of the EIA, we call it as scoping, and the result of the scoping is the terms of reference, and then the EIA study and preparation of the EIA report, and then the reviewing of the EIA report. It will be done by the technical review committee and a public review, and then the decision making and follow-up monitoring. So actually the agency, the project approving agency is responsible for the steps given in black, and the project proponent is responsible for the steps given in red. Okay, clear? In fact, actually, I will now move to the implementation issues. Now we have been practicing the environmental impact assessment process for nearly about 30 years now. So these are the major issues we have met. EIA still, this is the one of the, actually this is the issue of the process now. EIA is still considered a permitting instrument rather than a planning instrument. As I informed you, basically everybody thinks that EIA is a permitting tool. But as I told you at the very beginning, EIA basically benefits the project proponent if the EIA is carried out properly, because the project proponent himself can determine whether the project is environmentally feasible. So accordingly, that aspect has not been considered by many developers, and they believe that the EIA is an approval process and they consider it as a red tape accordingly. So this is the major issue we have faced. Still this problem remains. And the second one is misunderstanding exists within the project approval system that an EIA provides project approval when in fact it provides environmental approval only. This is a serious issue which cannot be understood by the people who are not in the system. But since we have been practicing this one, we have faced this issue very seriously, because everybody thinks once the EIA approval is granted, everything is all right. The project is approved. It's not that. Through the EIA process, we give only the environmental approval. There are so many approvals required by the project. Something like land clearances and various other kinds of approvals. Now, usually that is why for every mistake of a project, this EIA process is blamed by the society. But you have to think that you have to consider that EIA is only the environmental approval process, and through the environmental approval process, we consider only the environmental feasibility of the project. We do not consider the economic feasibility or technical feasibility of the project. It has to be determined by the project proponent himself. The economic viability and the technical viability of the project has to be determined by the project proponent or somebody else. It is not the responsibility of the project, the Central Environmental Authority. And it's not the responsibility of the EIA process. EIA process is the process for determining environmental feasibility of the project. Just keep in mind, so EIA approval is the environmental approval only. And the third is limited staffing capacity and institutional strengthening. So many state agencies, so I have explained you now that there is a system that we can appoint the project approving agencies to administer the EIA process. So basically the Central Environmental Authority has developed its competencies in evaluating EIA reports, but still CA is also having serious limited staff capacities. But in addition to the Central Environmental Authority, in many state agencies, many project approving agencies, they do not have staff capacities to face the constraints and to review the EIA reports, because their main mandate is not the EIA approval, something else, because of that they have not given their attention to develop their staff capacities in evaluating EIA reports. So this is a serious issue, especially in project approving agencies. And then conflict of interest. If you go through the project approving agency list, you can notice that some project approving agencies are ministries in charge of line agencies proposing projects, because the Ministry of Power and Energy is a project approving agency. So the central CB might propose projects, and usually according to that, we have to appoint the Ministry of Power and Energy as the project approving agency in case of power sector projects. But in case of power sector projects, now we have noticed that Ministry of Power and Energy has an interest, vested interest. So it's not actually Ministry of Power and Energy is not suitable to function as a project approving agency in case of power sector projects. Now, although the ministries are included in the project approving agency list, we never now appoint such ministries as project approving agencies. There are only very few agencies function as project approving agencies at present, especially Forest Department, Wildlife Department, Coast Conservation Department, and only the Mahawali Authority are functioning as the project approving agencies at present practically, though several agencies have been included in the project approving agency list. And the other one is weaknesses in methodologies used in analyzers and in determining alternative analysis. So basically, we have noticed that several technologies and methodologies have been developed in analyzing the environmental impacts and determining the most significant impacts, but nobody actually follows these procedures. Usually consultants are not competent enough in carrying out these analyses. And in addition, what we have noticed is the alternative analysis in EIA reports is also very weak. Impractical alternatives are given in EIA reports. So that, of course, actually these two aspects, and impact analysis and alternative analysis, are very poor in EIA reports. The lack of standards on the competence and professionalism of EIA consultants. At present, there is no such law that only these consultants need to carry out EIS. Anybody can carry out EIS at present according to the law. There is no accreditation system introduced to check the competency of EIA consultants. That's a serious issue. Often compromised by the expediency in getting approval. The project approving agency and even the government is in a hurry to get approval, and they believe that EIA is a red tape and they do not actually consider the quality of the EIA report. They want to do EIAs in a very short period and get approval within few weeks. So often this has often caused poor quality EIA reports. The consultants are not given adequate time to do a good EIA study. This is another serious issue. Then non-availability and lack of ready data. That's another issue. Consultants often complain that they cannot do research in collecting data. What they say is the government authorities should maintain databases so that they can get data with respect to EIAs. But as we all know, the government agencies are not maintaining databases at present. So each and every case, the consultants will have to collect data. So this will also take time. And then lack of post-EIA monitoring is also a serious issue. That is the weakest link in the EIA process. There are many issues relevant to that monitoring. Basically, in the Act also, the monitoring part is very weak. Nothing has been mentioned in that about the post-approval monitoring. Therefore, everybody has forgotten the approval monitoring procedures and everybody concentrates on only the approval process. So once the approval is given, the project proponent usually, some project proponents are very genuine and they follow the procedure and they implement all mitigation measures suggested in the EIA reports. But for some developers, they only consider the EIA approval as the approval and then they forget the approval conditions and do the project whatever they want. And then the timely and accountable and cost-effective implementation of environmental management plans. What we have noticed is serious environmental management plans have been included in EIA reports. Perhaps sometimes we may ask further developed environmental management plans subsequent to the EIA approval, but all are in books only. But these mitigation measures are not properly implemented timely. That is another serious issue. So it has to be implemented in parallel with the construction activities, but mainly developers concentrate on project activities. And once the project activities are completed only, they go for implementation of the environmental mitigation measures. Then actually the damage is done there. And then many mitigation measures suggested in the EIA reports are not cost effective. They are just, the consultants have just taken these mitigation measures from other sources and without even considering the cost effectiveness of these mitigation measures, they just include it in EIA reports. Then finally the project proponent cannot implement these mitigation measures because they are very costly. Because these are the major problems we have faced since introduction of the EIA report. Almost all these problems remain same. Addressing the challenges, then I move to the suggestions, proposals given by various authorities to overcome these issues. The best is consolidating limited resources to build technology strong, competent EIA administrative authority. Because now there are talks that this PA system is not working properly. There should be one strong agency to administer the EIA process. Even the Central Environmental Authority is not strong enough to administer the EIA process because we are also under the government, under a government ministry, and thus is not that independent. So there is a suggestion to establish a strong, competent and technically sound institute to administer the EIA process. And then improving the quality of EIA reporting and the standard of the consultancy by applying an accreditation system. There's a strong now lobbying by various agencies, various NGOs to introduce a kind of a accreditation system for EIA consultants. That's also a good move. Then improving monitoring and auditing of EIAs by introducing new amendments to the National Environmental Act. At present, the National Environmental Act does not talk about the monitoring procedures or monitoring provisions and monitoring responsibilities. Now that we have proposed new amendments, including the responsibilities of the project proponent and the responsibilities of the project approving agencies with respect to monitoring. And then upstreaming environmental planning using strategic and regional environmental assessments. Even for that, now we have introduced the strategic environmental assessment, new provision in the National Environmental Act, so that all plans and policies also may require impact assessment, so that once the plans are approved, So the plants are then environmentally friendly. So we can expect environmentally friendly plants. So then the project level EIS can be very simplified. Other major issues I have that is the environmental impact assessment process in Sri Lanka. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mrs. Kanthi De Silva, for an excellent presentation. And I would like, in fact, to point out a highlight of her presentation and to request the participants to keep that in mind. A point that she made, I mean, it's absolutely something that we should keep in mind, that the EIA process, the procedure has been kind of a permitting instrument rather than a planning instrument. I think that is an extremely important point to be taken into our minds as we go on to the next presentation. Thank you so much, Mrs. Kanthi De Silva. We'll come back to you with the questions because we already have quite a number of questions for you, but we would take them up at the panel discussion after the next presentation. So now I turn to the second presentation by Emeritus Professor P. Wickramagamage. Professor Wickramagamage is the former head of the Department of Geography, University of Peradeniya, and he was also one of the former directors of the Center for Environmental Studies, and I think mostly he is known as one of the most prominent GIS specialists in the country. He comes to the field of EIA from his experience of carrying out EIA studies in Sri Lanka. I think he has been a consultant and also a team leader in many environmental impact assessment projects. Therefore, he brings us the depth and breadth of environmental impact assessment process at the field level. So he would add a different dimension to the field of environmental impact assessment, away from what Mrs. Kanthi De Silva was talking about. So Professor Wickramagamage will be talking to us on challenges and issues of environmental impact assessment process in Sri Lanka as well. Over to you, Professor Wickramagamage.
Right, thank you, Nalani.
I would appreciate if you could keep to time of 20-25 minutes.
Yeah, I think I will be able to do it. Okay, good afternoon, everybody. Let me set the time. Okay, actually, some of the things that I have in my presentation also to a certain extent mentioned in the previous presentation. So the participants probably have a good idea about the EIA process. I'm not going to talk about the process. I'm looking more at problems and challenges, not necessarily from the point of view of Sri Lanka. I'm generally looking at the EIA process at a global level. I'm not going to go into detail. 20 minutes will not be enough for that. It will be very brief, but I will be focusing on EIA process in other countries as well. There are two extreme views about the EIA process, environmental management process. One is the minimalist view that Kanthi also mentioned, that it is just administrative procedure. It is a necessary evil, and you have to go through to get your project approved. That is one view. The other view is the deep ecologist view. Deep ecology, some of you might remember, it goes back to 1960s. We consider that 1950s was a major watershed in the history of the planet, and also some argue that the modern period is the man-dominated or human-dominated period. Therefore, we can call it Anthropocene. And whether it is acceptable or not, human domination is quite widespread since 1950s onwards. Therefore, the deep ecology arose in response to the environmental problems that appeared in the 60s. So they look at even EIA and various other instruments with suspicion. One of the worries they have is that there is no certainty about the predicted environmental consequences of a project. So, but these are two extremes that we have to navigate. And the EIA process actually lies between these two extremes. It will be fluctuating from one into the other. And the other issue that it's not just Sri Lanka, but Sri Lanka is particularly affected by this multidisciplinary and interdisciplinary approaches to environmental impact assessment. Multidisciplinary is experts, it's a collection of experts individually write their components and forget about the rest. Interdisciplinary is more cross-cutting. The objectives are similar to all experts, and therefore the expert opinions have to be integrated. The document should show that unity when we prepare the EIA. So extensive discussions and sharing ideas without leaving decision making to one particular expert about a particular type of impact. So we all have to make decisions. Now, decision making is essentially a qualitative, arbitrary. There is high degree of uncertainty in decision making. When we sit around a table to make a decision, we talk about major impacts, minor impacts, medium-sized impacts. All these terms are qualitative, and therefore coming to some kind of compromise is somewhat difficult. So interdisciplinary part is absent because it is more difficult, and our education system is not preparing people for interdisciplinary understanding of the world. We produce specialists at a school level, and thereafter they remain in their own little narrow corner. So there is no cross-cutting experience in academic circles. That is the problem in even in EIA preparation. Quality of EIA reports. The reviewers of EIA reports worldwide complain about the poor quality of EIAs. Most EIAs are considered as quick and dirty assessments. There are reasons for that. They are quick and dirty assessments. The time and resources allocated for EIAs are very limited. Because the developers never think EIA as a planning tool, okay, or decision-making tool. They think it is a barrier to their obstacle to overcome, and therefore they want to get it in 1 week or 2 weeks if possible. So they are not willing to spend a lot of time to complete the EIA. And also the funds they can allocate for EIA is also limited. They try to do it as with the most the lowest amount of smallest amount of money. So this actually affects the quality of the EIA, because sometimes EIA, particularly in countries like ours, data is not available. So data costs money. Most countries require a developer to fund the EIA. That's a major problematic area. The developer has to fund the EIA, and developer recruits the consultants. When he does it, the result is he thinks that the EIA consultant's job is to somehow get the EIA approved. So this problem has to be addressed any future amendment of the procedures. Otherwise, the consultants will not be able to escape from the dictates of the project proponents. If project proponents try to be independent and even go to the extent of rejecting projects, what will happen is that consultant or consultant team will be blacklisted, and thereafter no one will hire them. So this problem is there. And the situation in developing countries in general, the developing countries means they are not developing at all. And but their priorities, the government's priorities are achieving economic growth at the expense of everything. Economic growth must be achieved. And the other sector rapid expansion required is the energy sector. Energy projects have to be implemented as soon as possible. They are usually behind the schedules, and energy development is a pressing need. Third one is meeting the aspirations of the people. People living standards have to go up, and when it is not happening, people get frustrated, governments are kicked out, that kind of thing. So governments are interested in at least making people happy. So they have to give priority to these sectors. And the lowest priority is usually given to the environment, which is understandable. So we have to understand the political problems as well as the need to protect the environment. The other major problem in the developing countries is the lack of credible information. So if you don't have information, you have to find information, as Kanthi suggested. But information is very costly. You have very limited amount of money, and with that, I don't know how far you can go. Data is not available on major environmental aspects. Then available data is extremely expensive. Usually these data are available with the government, and they charge money or they deny access to the data. Or the data is available in paper files, and such data extracting is time consuming and difficult. And there is no quality control, even computerized, even when computerized data is available, there is no quality control for the data. So questionable quality of the data that we use. The related to this problem, it is not confined to environmental impact assessment, it is affecting the research output as well. We don't have extensive research literature on the environment in countries like ours. Data hoarding problem is the main cause of most of these issues. And the other thing, EIA is basically was transplanted in Sri Lanka. This was developed in the US to suit, even in the US when the EIA regulations were passed, and the politicians didn't even understand them. That is why they passed them. And after passing, they realized they created the monster from their point of view. It might have been the same in many other countries as well, in third world countries in particular. Knowledge gaps are there. In the 90s, I was involved in the EIA training programs. There were a large number of programs, several per year, like 10-day workshops. And there were hundreds of 1-day, 2-day, 3-day workshops. After 1914 or so, there were no such training programs. As a result, we have these problems. The preparers, members of technical committees, stakeholders, political authority, there are knowledge gaps. Lack of distinction between IEE, EIA. This is, I'm not going to go through all this because of the time is running out. The lack of distinction is mainly because at the time screening is done, very little information is available to the technical committee. With little information, how can you do a good job? So that problem is there. Solution may be in some other countries, IE is the first report that every project has to do. So based on the IE, the EIA requirement is decided. So if the IE is sufficient, then they don't go to EIA. So that's some kind of, because IE provide enough information for the screening process. Difficulty in establishing baseline status of this is one major issue that we confront. Environment is a hugely dynamic system. Certain environmental variables may remain static. For example, geology can be considered static at human time scales, but many other variables are rapidly changing. Some are actually changing daily, with or without the project. So what is the baseline? Baseline changes without project is there. So maybe sometime later we do the monitoring. For monitoring, we have to have a baseline. When we don't have good time series data, establishing baseline is difficult, because baseline has to be some mean value, not the bird's eye view of the environment that you get within a week or within a month or whatever. Public participation is another area that I would like to focus on. We have EIS required public review, but IEs don't have to have that. But whether it is IEE or EIA, the consultants study team has to explain the project to the people affected by the project. The people have to be educated, but it doesn't happen all the time. Sometimes the developer, including government agencies, think that giving all the information to the people means inviting for trouble. So you don't provide all the information. Questionnaire surveys are done, but that is mainly to get information from people, not to give information to the people. EIA reports are too technical. A lot of people don't understand them. Public comments are few in most cases. Even when you have a lot of public comments, then you have these political actors who are, depending on their political position, they either oppose the project or support the project. There are people, they set up these protest organizations for political reasons, nothing to do with the project. So these things also happen. The other thing is public has no way to get independent information. They have to listen to the study team or the developer, and there is no other source of information for them. For example, is my area landslide prone? There is no way. The government is spending a lot of money to map landslide prone areas. But can you get that? Can you find out from the internet, for example, whether your area is landslide prone? That is not possible. Health information is not available. Climate information is not available. Therefore, people have a problem, or members of the people who are more educated, more aware people can go into these and improve the awareness of the population in the affected area. But that is not possible because the information is not available. Cumulative impacts, that part is also neglected. So one solution might be to have a zoning plan for the entire country, or conduct SIAs, strategic impact assessments, in order to identify no-go areas. That we don't have such things except maybe protected areas. But even in protected areas, we do have projects. We do conduct the EIA studies. So protected areas are not immune from development activity. Lack or absence of monitoring is also mentioned. I will try to finish as soon as possible. Absence of monitoring. After the project is approved, the monitoring committees are in the EIA report, they are rituals rather than any useful things. I think wasting time on monitoring committees also. I don't know if it is meaningful. Right now, monitoring is not happening, and monitoring reports are not being filed. And at least I have never seen a monitoring report in the website or anywhere. Lack of political will, that these are obvious. If our phosphate project attempts to reduce the participation, public review period, attempts to remove energy projects from EIA, government agencies get away with violations. Sometimes the EIA is done, or EIA or IE is done after completing more than half of the project. All these things are happening. That is the commitment of the government. Conflict of interest, project proponents funding and recruiting consultants, PP, the tech members recommending their own organizations for special studies in the project area. And these are problematic issues. They should not be doing that. These are ethical things. Okay, there are some. I looked at the negative side of all the EIAs. That should not be taken as all negative in the EIA process. Actually, EIA has contributed quite a bit to raise awareness and also cut down on harmful environmental effects. But that is besides my presentation. I'm more looking at problems and challenges. So we need to, as concluding remarks, we need to balance between development and environmental protection. We will not be able to survive with environmental protection alone. We will not be able to survive with development alone. So these two have to be accommodating each other. So that is the sustainable development that we are hoping for. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Wickramagamage. It's very interesting that I have a whole lot of questions forwarded to us, but I would like to go back to Mrs. Kanthi De Silva's comment on permitting instrument, EIA being a permitting instrument rather than a planning instrument, and Professor Wickramagamage enlighten us with the kind of intricacies that we have actually when we try to study environmental impacts at the level of, at the field level. And also he highlighted some of the politics involved in the process, basically the quite a bit of issues and challenges that we have in the process. And all the three panelists, including myself, Mrs. Kanthi De Silva, joining with us from Colombo, and Professor Wickramagamage are there. And I would like to actually, rather than going through this series of individual questions, some of the questions seem to be very generic, some of the questions are very specific. Of course, asking about the legitimacy of the road across the Singharaja forest. I think this is not a question that we want to take up at this webinar. So I would move to more generic two issues that I can kind of summarize from these questions. And I would like both experts to comment on this. And one of the questions raised by several here is the way in which the EIA experts are selected. You know, whether there is a list of, you know, EIA experts to, you know, select from, whether there is, I think I can remember Mrs. Silva commented on the fact that there is no accreditation process at all. Can you say a little bit more on this, Mrs. Kanthi De Silva, and then I will come to Professor Wickramagamage?
Yeah, of course. Actually, the Central Environmental Authority maintains a list of EIA consultants who have expressed willingness to carry out EIAs. Actually, we haven't done any kind of review because actually we don't have authority and we don't have a actually mandate to review the personnel. So we have just maintaining a list of consultants who have expressed willingness to carry out the EIAs just to facilitate the developers, because developers sometimes come and ask us who are the EIA consultants who can carry out EIAs, but we never recommend any of the consultants. What we do is we issue the list of consultants who have registered with CEA, but that does not mean that EIA has to be carried out by the listed consultants. You can carry out the EIA by anybody who is competent enough to carry out the EIA. That's what I said, that at present there is no law to restrict the consultants to carry out EIAs, but we are in the process, and actually it's actually not under the NEA. Somebody has to introduce kind of accreditation system, and we have had discussions with the board of, there's a board to introduce this kind of an accreditation system, but actually CA does not have authority to introduce a system. Any kind of a professional organization can introduce this system, but CA can take up this matter by including in the law to say that only the accredited consultants can carry out the EIA. But CA can't maintain the accreditation, can't actually introduce an accreditation system. It's not within the mandate of CEA. What we can do is we can issue a law to say that only the accredited consultants can carry out EIAs. Some independent agency has to introduce this system.
I think this would be one of the highlights of this webinar as well, when you say that the Central Environment Authority can request that an accredited list be maintained.
Yes.
So I think we can take it from there, I suppose. We will also get back to Professor Wickramagamage, who has been a consultant and a team leader in many projects. If you want to comment on this issue of the quality of the EIA experts and how they are selected and so on, Professor Wickramagamage, over to you.
Actually, there is an industry developed around the EIA process in Sri Lanka, in the private sector particularly. There are many firms that have been established in order to act as a kind of a coordinating bodies to conduct EIAs. But the consultants that they usually selected are people who are willing to work for a certain fee. So unless there is a qualification requirement, right now there is no accreditation system, and therefore anybody can basically, whether you don't even have to have a degree, you can claim to be an expert in a field and conduct EIA. I don't think the CEA is in a position to prevent this happening, and accreditation system has to be coming from either from the universities or from the government itself. Some government agencies should come forward and issue accreditation certificates for qualified people to do EIAs. Maybe the universities can help. Maybe the Center for Environmental Studies can help because they were involved in conducting EIA training programs 10-year, as I mentioned in my presentation. 10-year EIA training programs were immensely successful. It was done not alone by the Central Environment, CES. It was done in cooperation with the CEA, Ministry of Environment, and various other agencies. That may be one forum, one agency. There may be others. So any of those should be able to, but I'm wondering if Kanthi might be able to help me on this. If qualification can be specified on the part of the, I mean, when you say expert, there must be evidence to show that the person is an expert or knowledgeable in EIA process. Right now, it is not there, and we made an effort at the very beginning in the 90s, I think, to form an association and come up with the accreditation, and the association failed. I think it never, I don't think it is there anymore.
I think this webinar itself is extremely, I think, important moment, I think, especially because of this particular issue that we are discussing at the moment of the selection process of the EIA experts and also their qualifications. And I think, Professor Wickramagamage, this relates back to your point of interdisciplinarity. Also because EIA study, of course, requires absolutely a group of people who can put things through and come up with kind of systemic problems and so on. So this is perhaps maybe as part of this conference itself, maybe the Center for Environmental Studies can take some steps towards preparing a draft, and maybe the Center for Environmental Studies can work with the Central Environmental Authority in order to get this going, I suppose. With that note, of course, I move to the second area where I have received some questions from. This is more to do with the process of monitoring. Mrs. Kanthi De Silva, actually, they have forwarded this question to you. Some of them are asking whether what kind of authority that the Central Environmental Authority has in ensuring if there is a monitoring plan that will be, that will be adhered to.
Yeah. Now, in fact, actually, I have to say that in the EIA report, it's true that we expect all this information to be included in the EIA report, in impact analysis, mitigation plan, and monitoring plan. But we know that during the preparation of the EIA report, the developers or the consultants are actually unable to submit us a very clear environmental management plans, because usually this environmental management plans are developed during the detailed designing stage. So we accept that in the EIA report, only the conceptual mitigation plan is acceptable to us. So, but in the EIA approval letter, we very clearly ask them to submit us a detailed mitigation plan, including the monitoring plan, prior to commencing construction activities, and get our consent for the environmental mitigation plan. But as I said in my presentation, but this requirement has not been included in the law, but we put it as a condition of the environmental approval letter. But the problem we are having is, usually we do not get this kind of detailed environmental management plans indicating the and the responsibility of implemented, and these details are never submitted to CEA. So now in the amendment, we are proposing to include the submission of EMP as a mandatory requirement subsequent to the EIA approval, so that we expect that the developers will have to submit a detailed environmental management plan subsequent to the EIA approval, so that monitoring can be done without, that a formal kind of without ad hoc manner, we can do a kind of a very systematic manner, the monitoring can be done. At present, monitoring is done in an ad hoc manner without a proper mitigation plan. It's very difficult for us to go and inspect and see whether the compliance are met, because in the EIA report, mitigation measures are written in very generic terms. Now we are expecting a detailed mitigation plan under the new amendments. Still, it has not been published. Once it is published, the developers will have to adhere to that law. So they will have to submit a detailed mitigation plan. Then we can actually do a kind of a systematic monitoring with that detailed mitigation plan.
There is also a question about the process of public hearing. Maybe I would like Professor Wickramagamage to comment on this, because his involvement with various environmental impact studies. The issue of public hearing, to what extent public hearing is a kind of an independent exercise within the framework of an EIA study, or whether there are influences from the project proponents and project approving agencies in the process of public hearing. There is a question. This is, of course, addressed to Mrs. Kanthi De Silva, but Professor Wickramagamage can comment, and maybe that you can come later.
Yeah.
Yeah, my own experience.
The question is about Professor Wickramagamage, to what extent this component of public hearing is a kind of an independent component within the process of environmental impact assessment, whether there are other kinds of influences from various parties.
There are, I mean, as far as I'm concerned, I have never seen any project proponent. Most of the EIS we did were for the government sector, not for the private sector, only few for private sector. We did not come under any kind of influence. We are not asked to hide any information, but I know instances where information is hidden from the public. You don't explain the project in detail, and but there are also problems. I can relate one problem we experienced during the, it's not really EIA, but environmental assessment of a pump storage project in Madhusim area. There was a site we were to examine it. We did half of the work. We were supposed to have public meetings and so on. But halfway through, we got calls from the ground Iladari. The people are waiting to beat us up when we come to the site. So that was the only site where we could not conduct a public meeting. So we basically abandoned that site. Not we, even the proponent decided to abandon the site. We did the public meetings for all other sites that were selected for the study. Similarly, we did the Kuragala, the Reservoir Project EIA, which was under Northwestern Provincial Authority. We had very detailed meetings, public meetings, and the entire team went and we answered all our questions. Still, the project dragged on for years because of the difficulty in finding suitable land. So I don't know any instance where we were influenced by the proponent, but I have anecdotal evidence that such things do happen.
Yeah, actually, I would get back to Mrs. Kanthi De Silva with a very different and an interesting question, which might be very interesting. One of the participants is asking whether what action can the CEA or PAA take if there is evidence that the project proponent is not complying with the EIA? That's a good question for you, Mrs. Kanthi De Silva. I mean, has there been such experience in Sri Lanka?
Of course, yes, there are so many. In fact, you know that usually in the environmental approval letter, we define the mitigation measures which need to be complied with. So we have authority according to that to take legal action if any of the conditions are not met by the project proponent. That provision is there.
Can you give some examples if there are any such?
Of course, actually, there are many examples. I will take the controversial this Umaoy project. A lot of conditions were put because we all know that the environmental impact assessment was not that comprehensive. And that was actually one of the examples of getting environmental approval in a hurry. So the consultants, I believe, that have not been, were not given, I don't know exactly that aspect, because what the consultants are telling that they were not given adequate time to do a proper EIA. So many of the studies were pending at the time of submission of the EIA report to CEA, and the government also expected a kind of an approval in a hurry. So we had to give approval subject to various kinds of conditions. One of the conditions was to carry out a detailed geological study to determine the stability of the area. But without carrying out the geological study, the commence the construction activities. That was the problem of the project. So there were a lot of actually criticisms about the EIA process and various other things. But what I have to tell you is, as I said, that through the EIA process, we can't look after everything. Actually, the major issue of the project is the technical feasibility of the project, not the environmental impact assessment as such. So, but there are various actually instances, actually the project proponents have not complied with the conditions, but we have not taken legal action again to stop the project. We have advised, but many have complied with the advices subsequently. Yes. And corrected the mistakes. Even the Ummao case, they then actually stopped the project immediately and did various studies, and then actually again started the project with that mitigation measures. It's a kind of an improvement to the project during the monitoring period. There are various instances. What I can say is stopping the project is not the solution, but we have given certain advices and they have actually complied with the subsequent advices.
Oh, I see. Mrs. De Silva, there are two small questions which I find interesting. Of course, one is, of course, is there a specified period of validity for an EIA report? There is a question from participant. Like when an EIA report is submitted, I mean, how long it will be valid?
Actually, we have not defined a validity period for the EIA report, but in the environmental approval letter, we have given a validity period, usually 3 years. The approval letter is valid for 3 years. So the developer has to carry out the construction activities within a period of 3 years. Usually many of the developers request another kind of actual extensions to the validity period. So considering prior to granting extension to the validity period, we actually do check the performance of the project. After checking the performance only, we do extend the validity period of the environmental approval letter, not the EIA report.
Not the EIA. And also there is a small question here about the concept paper of a project that should be submitted to the environmental impact, CEA, Central Environment Authority. And is there a particular format for this, or this is pretty much an open procedure?
Yes, actually there's a specific format. You can download it from the CEA website. We call it as Basic Information Questionnaire. So the developers have to submit their project proposal through that questionnaire.
And if you can also at the same time comment a little bit more on the public consultation process. You know, how long the reports are kept at certain places. I know when there's a particular project.
Now, in the law, there's a mandatory public consultation period for 30 working days. So we keep the EIA report at places which is very actually convenient to the general public. So usually at the divisional secretariats where the project is to be located, and any other government office which is very close to the project area, and the Central Environmental Authority also, so that anybody can come and refer to the project. And we publish the we publish this notice in newspapers, informing the public that this report is available at these places and from these dates. Usually 30 working days. That includes about 1.5 calendar months. And that is the mandatory public consultation, but we always encourage the developers to have public consultations during preparation of the EIA report, during carrying out the EIA study, which is not happening always.
And how about the language? When you put these announcements in the newspapers, I mean, do we
in all 3 languages, because we get the EIA report in all 3 languages. And likewise, we put the advertisement also in all 3 languages, in all 3 national newspapers. And even the CA website, it's available.
Most of the information is available at the CA website?
CA website, yes. We upload the EIA report also.
We do have several other few questions, but I think we also need to wind up the webinar because we have spent more than the scheduled 1 hour time period. So I would like to basically to conclude the webinar. And I would like to recollect a point that Mrs. Kanthi De Silva made. For some reason, this keeps coming back, this particular point that you made on how the environmental impact assessment has been a kind of a permitting instrument rather than a planning instrument. And if I relate it back to what Professor Wickramagamage was talking about, I think there are a lot of issues and challenges that we have. I think we are not thinking of it as a planning instrument. We just want to get the approval for a project, so the basic mechanisms are followed and an EIA study is done and so on. And I would really like to, like our participants to think along this point actually, and also to focus on the kind of issues that Professor Wickramagamage has been talking about. And for me, of course, coming from a very, very strictly social science background, of course, the entire EIA process, I think, is driven by a very simple philosophy. I think it is extremely important for us to keep in mind that a damaged environment is not an asset for the society. I mean, although we tend to highlight EIA as a very, a tool, a method, something that we do technically as a study and so on, how we can bring it to our everyday life as a basic philosophy by understanding that, a damaged environment is not an asset for anybody for that matter. Keeping that in mind, of course, I tend to interpret the entire environmental impact assessment process as a philosophy that is driven towards making the entire process of development more and more responsible. And with that note, of course, I think we need to conclude the webinar, and I would like to request the participants to keep in touch with the two panelists, Mrs. Kanthi De Silva and Professor Wickramagamage. And if you have more and more questions, I think you can forward them to us, and we would try to see whether we can respond to some of them through our emails. And I would like to conclude the webinar by saying thank you to those who made this webinar possibility. First of all, of course, I was told initially that more than 500 participants registered for this webinar. I think that itself is an indicator of the enthusiasm and the interest that a lot of participants have on this particular topic. Therefore, I really thank you all for your participation for this webinar and the enthusiasm that you have shown on this very important field of study. And of course, the two experts, Professor Wickramagamage and Mrs. Kanthi De Silva, who has been with us and with very comprehensive presentations. And I think rather than giving us solutions, I think both presentations made us to think more and more. That is extremely important. And also to the two coordinators of this conference, Professor Tilak Hemavasan from the Department of Geography and Dr. Shami Jinadasa from the International Relations Office of the University of Peradeniya. and all those backstage supporters that I don't really know, and also Dr. Dinoshi Samarajiva, who has been working meticulously to contacting with us and getting this going and coming to this day. As I conclude, last but not least, I would like to recollect two people who have been instrumental in introducing and establishing the field of environmental impact assessment process in Sri Lanka. And I feel that it is my duty to, they deserve recognition. And first of all is Professor-Emeritus Professor C.M. Madhum Bandara, who was the founder of the Center for Environmental Studies, who laid the foundation, I believe, as far as I know, for the field of EIA to establish in Sri Lanka with his collaborative work with the USID and the NARE project, as I can remember way back in 1992. We should, it is his hard work that we are here today. And second, of course, following up from him is late Professor Kanthi De Silva, who was a member of the original team who went to Tennessee, United States for the first training program initiated by NARE project. And I think ever since that, he's also one of the key persons who was also at one point the director of the Center for Environmental Studies, who has been instrumental in promoting and disseminating knowledge on this particular field. With that, of course, we also recognize that the Center for Environmental Studies, all the way from early 90s, as we introduced the environmental impact assessment process in Sri Lanka, the Center for Environmental Studies has also played a very big role, a key role in this field, as Professor Wickramagamage mentioned, of course, in the early 90s, of course, quite late, almost until 2000, 2003, I would say, the Center for Environmental Studies used to carry out the 10-day intensive EIA workshops, of course, with collaboration with the Central Environmental Authority. And the Center for Environmental Studies continues to play an important role, I think, in carrying forward this legacy. With that note, I would like to adjourn this webinar. Thank you all.